Megaman 8 was the last entry in the classic series for over a decade, and when I would watch videos of people discussing it, they would say, oh, it's the black sheep of the franchise and that it was a bad entry, and not really elaborate further. I guess they called it the black sheep because they only did this art style once for the classic series, but a lot of gameplay ideas in 8 are from 7, so I guess there's 2 black sheeps then. At the time of this title's release, the Mega Man Classic series was slowing down a little, especially comparing it to the output of the X series on the Super Nintendo. The X series got a trilogy where the classic games just got Mega Man 7, soccer games excluded. In the following gen, on the PS1, the X series again got another trilogy, whereas classic just got Mega Man 8, kart racers excluded. I get the impression that even at the time, none of the Mega Man games ever sold gangbusters, but they were successful enough to justify making these games since the turnarounds were quick and budgets lower than something like a Resident Evil. Mega Man 8 though must not have sold well compared to the X series because Capcom put the brakes on it for over a decade. I assume comparing the gameplay of the X series to the classic makes them look slow and childlike. The X series had more of an edgier, hardcore tone in its aesthetic. Even the gameplay was much faster and intense. Capcom may have seen the classic series as redundant, which is a shame because I think this is one of the best entries, and I think it's a shame that it's constantly overlooked. The art style is very fitting for the series. It seems to capture that more simplistic anime style that the promotional materials of the first game had, but it's a more evolved version of that where characters can have additional detail. Even Mega Man looks taller than we're used to seeing him. The designs of all the bosses are fantastic, and because we have more advanced sprite work, it allows for more complex boss designs. Most of these wouldn't really translate to 8-bit seamlessly. It's easy to forget that the bosses were created by kids in Japan. Since the second game, there was a contest that had readers submit drawings of ideas for bosses. Some of these submissions for 8, I question if they were actually made by kids, but regardless, the idea was novel and was a way to make the game for kids by kids. I believe this was the last game to do this, and I get it's much harder to do it since planning a game takes much longer than it did in the 90s, especially since they have to theme a whole stage around the Robot Master. Speaking of which, the stages are all extremely colorful and diverse. The levels have always been in the theme of the Robot Masters, but here it seems much grander in tandem with the stage gimmicks and background animations. The art style also pairs with the new animated FMV cutscenes. Mega Man X3 started having these anime cutscenes in the Saturn and PS1 ports, but Mega Man 8, instead of just using it in the intro, sprinkles it in more throughout the entire game. People talk about these scenes as a downside, but I don't get why. Yeah, the voice acting is bad, but it's hilarious. The voice actors, I assume, were not given good directions by someone who probably didn't speak English well, and all things considered, it could have been worse. The emotions that need to come across from the characters is done better here than something like the first Resident Evil. One game where the voice direction is done by someone who doesn't know the language, and the other from someone who isn't from Earth. The plot is slightly more involved than previous titles. It's still just Wily trying to conquer the world, just with the added element that an evil space robot corpse is being used to power up the Robot Masters, which doesn't really seem to be connected to Wily. In the game, Wily doesn't even mention the Robot Masters once. These guys just have the evil energy from that corpse, and Mega Man needs to defeat them to get it back. Maybe some of these guys weren't even evil to begin with and became corrupt after finding the evil energy, and then Mega Man has to old yell at them since they're too far gone. Dr. Light sends Mega Dude to the crash site of the corpse of the evil robot, which just so happens to land on Dr. Wily's base. This stage acts as the intro tutorial level, something that's become the norm since the first Mega Man X. It's ideal to do this since the developers don't have to make the first part of each stage act as the tutorial since that's already out of the way. This one works just fine. It has an odd split where you can go to an area where you learn you can actually swim for the first and only time in a classic Mega Man game. I think it would have been better to cut this since the level with water is much later in the game and it gives you plenty of space to learn the mechanic anyways. You also obtain a weapon power-up without having to beat a Robot Master. It's a soccer ball that ricochets when kicked. I'm glad that this power-up is not something earned because it would make the disappointment of using it much worse. It's a great idea, but it's hard to gauge where it's going, and the game doesn't tell you that you can actually angle it a bit by holding a direction before you kick, which will be needed later. The act of having to hit a button twice to use it is also confusing. It forces the player to have a faster reaction upon using it, and there is no other utility when it's just on the floor. Since you can't take it with you when platforming, it just gets wasted. I think hitting the button once and having the ball come out immediately would have been ideal. Now the ball does have a use the devs didn't intend for. Shooting the ball out and jumping on its explosion will allow you to jump infinitely. But most people playing wouldn't have any idea about that, so it's relegated to being in your way when cycling through better weapons. I will say the ball does teach the player that bosses have weaknesses with this giant crab. He can be somewhat difficult if you're using only the Mega Buster and aren't using the slide. After finishing the intro stage, you're greeted with the choice between 4 robot masters. Having the boss selection split between 8 bosses started in 7, and I think this is a great structure. Fighting the bosses exclusively using their weaknesses takes a lot away from the challenge and makes them way too quick and forgettable. This way, you're forced to engage with at least 2 of the bosses without using their weakness as a crutch. It also increases their utility in the second half since you're forced to use them for obstacles and puzzles throughout the later stages, making them much more memorable. This gives the weapons more of a second function beyond just combat, except the water balloons. In past games, they did have weapons be a sorta key to find optional items like E-tanks, and it does do that here with bolts, the in-game currency. Speaking of the currency, the bolts are pretty out of the way most of the time. You have to sometimes solve a little puzzle with the weapons you have, or do a risky jump to collect them. They are worth getting though, since the shop has very effective power-ups like reducing the charge shot time, not being knocked back when taking damage, or sliding faster. The most useless is definitely climbing ladders faster. There is not one moment in the game where I thought this upgrade could help. These power-ups balance out not having E-tanks, since some of those make the game way too easy. Looking at one of the first 4 initial stages, Frost Man's stage is infamous for its difficulty. This is solely because of the snowboard segments in which a sign with an icon appears that tells you to jump, 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 or slide, slide, slide. I'm not even that good at platformers, but I think this isn't that bad, and its difficulty is overblown a bit. I beat this game twice for this video on the PS1 and Sega Saturn on original hardware, and played the level a 3rd time on the second Legacy Collection on the Xbox One, and was able to beat it very consistently. That being said, I played the GameCube version in the Mega Man Anniversary Collection, and it drove me insane how much I was dying. Usually I don't notice input lag, but here I was feeling it big time. I have a gut feeling this is the origin of the bad rep the stage got. Beyond the snowboard gimmick, others include these ice blocks being pushed around. If you time your jump really well, you can reach higher areas, but I can't pull this off. I absolutely love the aesthetic of this part too. The bustling streets and city lights make this one of the better looking Mega Man stages in the series, and the boss fight with Frost Man is certainly the easiest one in the game. I think his size is meant to scare players off, but if you slide under his jumps and jump when he attacks on the ground with charge shots, you'll beat him in no time. Tengu Man stage is interesting because in the Sega Saturn version, it uses a completely different, and in my opinion, inferior song. It sounds more dire in tone, and it's not a bad tune, but comparing it to the blissful joy of the PS1 version, it's no contest. No clue why they changed it, because the Saturn version came a little bit after the PS1 release. Perhaps they thought the less joyful song was more fitting. I do like the main stage gimmick of playing a side-scrolling shooter. It perfectly contrasts with the snowboarding one where you're mostly focused on your jumps, and here it's your shooting. You can collect Mega Man's buddies as temporary power-ups, and it's great seeing these guys in actual gameplay with you and contributing to the fight. It feels awesome if you manage to collect the whole squad at once. Tengu Man himself is one of the harder bosses in this first set, and even if you do have his weakness, you need to wait for the right moment to use it. I really wish this happened more often in the series, let alone this game. Not all bosses have this dynamic of needing to wait for your moment to strike with their weakness. Frost Man and Grenade Man, you can just spam the move at them anytime until they die, which takes less than a minute. There are moments where they do have more of a reaction to it, but I think the weakness shouldn't have worked until these select moments. Once you have these weaknesses, the challenge and the fun of the fight is just sucked out. This has been the case for all Mega Man titles before this, and I would argue that Mega Man 1 through 6 don't really have any boss fights of any note. It's usually just a combo of them jumping and shooting something at you. Mega Man X is when the bosses had more going on and more interesting moves to keep you on your toes. With Mega Man 8, I think it's smart to have the Mega Buster usable at the same time as your other weapons. It allows you to be more conservative with the special weapons meter, which is perfect for bosses you need to be a little more patient for, like Tengu Man and Clown Man. I theorized it allowed for the devs to make power-ups a bit weirder and have other utilities outside of battle. For example, if you needed to use the electric claw throughout a stage, cycling back and forth between that and the Mega Buster every time would slow the pace way down. With the exception of one of these, all of the weapons are extremely unique and aren't just better versions of the Mega Buster. I know everybody loves the metal blades in Mega Man 2, but that completely made the Mega Buster invalid. It was stronger and could shoot anywhere, and you could say that it was balanced out by having limited ammo, but it doesn't use that much to begin with. You can just play through every stage with just the metal blades, and you'd collect enough ammo to keep your meter full easily. With Searchman's weapon in 8, you can see some parallels with the metal blade, but it does go through ammo quickly, and you don't find ammo as frequently as in Mega Man 2. Most of the weapons in 8 are fun to use, especially when you have to discover the best one for the job. We'll get to the one that's not fun later on. I got a feeling people recommend Clown Man as the starter boss, and there's an argument to be made there. His stage is the easiest of the bunch, and the gimmicks aren't as intrusive. However, I do think the actual boss fight is much harder than Frost Man's. You're required to be more patient since in one of his moves he's invulnerable, and in the other he's much harder to hit unless you have his weakness. I think new players are better off starting with Frost Man if you're looking to gradually increase the challenge. It's no coincidence that the two easier bosses give you the weaknesses of the two harder ones. Grenade Man stage has the player focusing on their speed. There's time bomb platforms you need to quickly jump off of, but if you're too rash on your jumps, you might force yourself into an even worse scenario, so you need to plan ahead. Speed is also important since the platforms explode behind you. Once lit by the enemy, you need to quickly map out your path before it falls out from underneath you. I think the gimmick with the different color bomb platforms could have gone a bit further. If you shoot a certain color of these bombs, only that color explodes, but I wish there were longer segments where if you were mindlessly shooting, you'd be punished for it by having the platforms blow up from underneath you. The fight with Grenade Man himself is the most similar to those NES-style boss fights where he's mostly jumping around and shooting. He does have an explosion that lingers, followed by falling debris you need to avoid. A cool surprise is near the end of the fight, he blows the floor from underneath you, changing the battleground to uneven terrain, which makes it harder for you to move around. After you beat all 4 bosses and watch the cutscene, you play a shorter stage that has you use some of the weapons outside of battle to collect extra bolts. These bolts are easier to get than in the normal stages, so assuming the player is having a hard time getting them, the ones from this mid-level should leave them at a decent starting point. Also, if the player was somehow oblivious to these weapons being used for stage obstacles, this serves as a second tutorial since from here on out, it's gonna be mandatory. If you have the Saturn version, if you go a little out of your way, you can fight an exclusive boss from Mega Man 1 being Cut Man. Unlike the other bosses you fought, he has his Mega Man 1 stage theme play in the background. His weakness is something you can't earn until you beat Sword Man, who's in the second set of bosses. Even with his weakness though, it doesn't do that much damage. I think this was meant to be a challenge for the player since it's so out of the way and it's ideal to use the Mega Buster. You won't get Cutman's weapon, but at least you get an extra bolt. The boss fight with Duo at the end of the stage isn't too special, and since he doesn't have a health bar, you're encouraged to just unload on him whatever weapon you have until Proto Man shows up to stop the fight. After this, the previous 4 Robot Masters are exchanged for 4 new ones. As I mentioned earlier, these stages force the use of weapons that you've already earned. In addition to that, the stages and bosses themselves are much harder than the previous set. Since you can't pick all 8 stages at once, the difficulty is able to ramp up after the first set. If all the stages were selectable at once, then the stages and bosses have to be balanced around the same difficulty. The 2 easier stages to start with, in my opinion, are Sword Man and Aqua Man's levels. Sword Man stage has you using the 4 weapons you've earned to solve simple puzzles. Your hint to use them beyond the icons near the entry points are the enemies endlessly dropping weapon energy. You're left to think that there's a reason why they keep providing this energy, and hopefully figure out that it's for this particular room. After this section, there's a small raft on lava that'll move in the direction you push the 2 buttons. This isn't a bad stage gimmick, since other games would have the raft move on its own, but here you have to control it yourself. This is much more interesting since you can't just jump at every obstacle your way, since it can speed up unexpectedly and lead to instant death. Aqua Man stage itself is probably the easiest of the 4 here, the main gimmick being water, go figure. You have to get used to swimming by weaving around enemies and obstacles. Later you have to do this while fighting against the current, and you'll be tempted to mash away, but you have to thread the needle so you don't die from the spikes above. The sub-bosses up to this point I haven't found particularly noteworthy, but this is pretty unique. You're in constant freefall on a waterfall with logs acting as platforms. It's impossible for you to fall to your death since one of these logs will spawn no matter what. The challenge here is trying to hit the boss with these inconsistent platforms. A lot of your weapons just don't work here since they'll fall down. It's a thrilling fight that forces you to use a limited amount of your arsenal. The boss fight with Aqua Man himself is shockingly hard compared to his easier stage. It just feels like anything barely does any damage. His pattern isn't that unpredictable though, I think I'm just a dummy. The curious part is the weapon you gain from him, the water balloon. I honestly don't understand what value this weapon has, and it may be one of the worst in the series. You can shoot more at once than your standard Mega Buster, and it doesn't take too much weapon energy, but it also doesn't do that much damage either. I've searched to see if there's another use for these, but there isn't anything beyond being effective against Wily's first form. That alone doesn't justify this thing's existence. You're just stuck with this through the rest of the game, and it just gets in the way when you're trying to cycle to the more useful weapons. You'd think that the weapon you'd get is the attack where Aqua Man creates a path of water for you to hit. This attack wouldn't be amazing either for Mega Man since you'd probably have to stand still to use it, but at least it'd be fun to use and control the water's path. Perhaps they could have created switches that could be hit by making a difficult path with the water. I would have even taken the overused shield power-up that's actually absent in this entry. I suppose one useless weapon is better than the series average though, where half of them are useless. Searchman stage is the most standard of all of these. The gimmicks here are pretty light, the main one being using the electric claw to swing. You can take alternate paths within the stage, but ultimately they lead to the same areas. In the Saturn version, there's an added required sub-boss fight with the Mega Man 2 boss Woodman. His pattern is extremely simple and repetitive, but my dumb ass just can't see through it. It took me way longer than it should have to beat him with the Mega Buster. It's not really a stage gimmick since it's not required, but you can burn these thorny bushes with the flame sword, which kinda hints at what to do for the actual boss fight with Searchman. Speaking of that fight, might be one of the harder ones with just the Mega Buster. With their weakness, you can burn through one of the 3 bushes they hide behind, leaving Searchman in a stun state if you get it right. Looking at Astro Man stage, I think this is certainly the low point of all of them. There's a fine line between a fun challenge and a frustrating experience, and this leans more towards the latter. With the platforms disappearing intermittently, I think it should have had more of a rhythm to it. Something in the vein of how the disappearing blocks worked in the past Mega Man games. These just have you stop any kind of flow you might be having, keeps the player waiting, and later throws some tricky platforming at you. What adds to the frustration are the spawning enemies that bombard you. Even if that part wasn't bad, you have these terrible mazes that you have to get through. The tornado hold is essential here since it makes it easier to backtrack. Having to remember which doors you open and close can get confusing, and the fact that the stage loops just adds to that effect. I've heard people complain that the exit isn't clearly defined since it's just a Wily skull on the floor. I think adding a floating teleportation orb like from Swordsman stage could have been helpful. After finishing the stage, players probably weren't too happy that the boss fight can take a while without the weakness. Since Astro Man is so high up, you only have so many chances to hit him with the Mega Buster. Astro Man's power-up being a screen clear I believe is the first in the series and can be helpful if you're feeling swarmed. It's not too effective against most bosses though, so I guess I had to be balanced one way or another. Once all the Robot Masters are defeated, Wily's castle then opens up to you. You can go back to the previous stages to find more bolts to power yourself up, and surprisingly all of the power-ups stack. This Wily's castle feels shorter than most, having 4 stages, which is actually the average up to this point. Only 3 games in the classic series have had more than 4 stages. Maybe it's just because I expect the final Skull stage to not be the actual final one. The Wily Castle stages have more difficult versions of previous stage gimmicks, and the snowboarding part here is actually pretty hard. I think the devs got away with this being so difficult since you essentially have infinite lives by making the sequence be the first thing on the first stage. If you keep dying and run out of lives, you'll end up back here anyways. What's less forgivable is the boss at the end. You have to get to a cocoon robot that is impossible to hit with most of your weapons. The game wants you to use a soccer ball, which most people aren't gonna immediately jump to, since most players probably ignored it for most of the game anyways. If you didn't know that you could hold up for a different angled shot, then this fight is gonna be even more of a pain in the ass. Even with angling the shot up, the ball doesn't go straight, so you still have to line up your shots regardless. You can get some hits in with the tornado hold, ice shot, and the comets, but they barely do any damage. I think instead of solely depending on the ball, being clever with the other weapons should have been rewarded with more damage. This might be the worst boss in the game for me. The other 2 Wily stages, you'll do another side-scrolling shooter section, but now ending with a boss. This one is the opposite of the previous one, and you can actually do decent damage using whatever weapon you throw at it. It's not until the 3rd boss with Base that you're back to fighting someone on your level. I suppose by this game's logic, Base is more of a sub-boss though. I'm surprised there wasn't more of these fights spread out in the game, like when Proto Man was introduced in Mega Man 3, or Break Man, I guess. I think it would have been interesting if, as Mega Man gets stronger with all these power-ups he's collected, so does Base by him changing up his strategies and adding a new move for you to learn to counter, with the final battle playing out how this one does by him combining with Trouble, which makes him look more intimidating, and it shows the player that this is the last bout between you. The true end stage boss, the Green Devil, is a redesign of the recurring boss, the Yellow Devil. These fights play out the same each time in a battle of patience, where you have to hit its exposed eye in a short window. I always love the way the devils have looked, but despite them being iconic bosses, I've never really liked fighting them. This one might be the easiest one yet, since its pattern is easy to avoid, but you have to pierce its jello shell with the grenade and hit the eye with something else like the Thunderclaw. It seems whatever weapon you use, nothing does that much damage. If this fight was shorter, I probably would have appreciated the puzzle you have to solve to hurt this guy more. His sprite's animation and general design are incredible, I just wish his fight was too. The final stage has you going through the traditional gauntlet of all 8 previous Robot Masters. These fights is where my argument to use the Mega Buster only goes out the window, because you need to conserve as much health and energy as possible for the final boss. The gauntlet of bosses at the end shows your player's growth by you just destroying these guys in 10 seconds, but I wish there was a bit of a twist on these fights instead. Like maybe one where you have to fight 2 at once, where even if you have the weakness, you have to prioritize who you deem the bigger threat. I don't know about how the hardcore mega heads feel about this trope, but I'm pretty much over it. The Wily fight only has 2 forms this go around, but it's hard in a game with no E-tanks. The one time the water balloons are useful is for his first form, but his second one is much harder to hit, with attacks that are very difficult to avoid. This is the time I just used all the rush power-ups I forgot I had out of sheer desperation. These power-ups you get from defeating some of the sub-bosses, but I never used them until the end. It's not like these don't automatically refill either, they just don't have that much use in normal stages. You have to earn the health here too, since Rush will fly over and randomly drop health and weapon energy all across the screen for you to scavenge. The other, he drops down in front of you to give you a random item, and it's not guaranteed to be health or even anything at all. I do think all of these elements make this much more of a challenge. It's the final boss after all. If you're new to the Mega Man series, this, in my opinion, is the best starting point for getting into the classic series. It's more forgiving than most entries and ramps up its difficulty gradually instead of just being hard the whole time. The art style is very appealing with fantastic music. This entry has a soundtrack that themes the stage's music to better fit the environment, such as Clown Man stage sounding like something from a circus, Swordsman stage being an ancient Aztec temple, with the song sounding very mysterious, or Astro Man stage having a sci-fi theme that the song reflects as well. My personal standouts are Frostman's theme and Tengu Man's PS1 theme. Overall, these tracks give me a much more subdued and calm vibe compared to past entries. The songs in those were shorter and the melody had to hit much sooner due to the NES hardware limits. I think that might contribute to why people think Mega Man's 8 soundtrack is forgettable comparatively. Mega Man 8 marked the 10th anniversary of the series. Its celebration determined what was exclusive to the PS1 and Saturn versions. As mentioned earlier, the Saturn had Woodman and Cutman as extra bosses. The PS1, though, got an extra booklet called the Mega Man Anthology. Growing up, I remember I was given a new sealed copy of the game on the PS1, but I didn't get this booklet. That's apparently because there were issues with the manufacture of the booklets, so most copies didn't include them. Not even the limited edition version of the game, but only in the Anniversary Collector's Edition, which I assume was the first one printing. The booklet was slotted right behind the game's manual, and it's cool it's in color at least. They did kind of fuck up by swapping Mega Man 5 and 6's promo images though, so that's kind of funny. This is only 12 pages though, and doesn't provide any secret knowledge on the series' past. Sony got the short end of the stick compared to the Saturn. Sony also apparently wanted an exclusive feature to the game versus the Saturn, and I'd be blown away if they were satisfied with this little tiny booklet no one even knew existed when this game released. They got the better Tengu Man song at least. In the game itself, the opening shows Mega Man fighting a boss from each game, and it's a great way to look back on the series for its 10th anniversary. Clown Man stage has references to past enemies and bosses as toys in the background and foreground, and the added boss fights in the Saturn version could have been in reference to the anniversary. These could have been planned to be included regardless of the anniversary, but it's still cool to see these nods to past titles. Speaking of collections, in 2004, Capcom released the Mega Man Anniversary Collection. Included were all 8 Mega Man games and both Power Battle titles as unlockables. The menu UI even uses Mega Man 8's art style as the template. The version of Mega Man 8 in this compilation is mostly inoffensive and unfortunately uses the PS1 version over the Saturn. The big flaw is the input lag for the snowboarding segments as mentioned earlier. Thankfully, this was fixed in the Mega Man Legacy Collection for PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. In this collection, you can even reduce the damage you take if you want to make it easier, in addition to being able to save state anywhere. They still use the PS1 version though, which really makes me think that they just lost the code for the Saturn version at this point. Sadly, there's little to no replay value for this game, and once you beat it, that's really it. There's no New Game Plus or extra content to be discovered. Nothing wrong with that, of course. I like the idea of a game just being an isolated experience that doesn't need to entice you to replay it over and over. I'm curious to see a world that, if this was successful enough to warrant a more immediate sequel 1 to 2 years after this game's release, rather than the Mega Man 9 that we have now. I think the sprite art and the gameplay ideas that they had were fantastic, and it's a shame it was just a one and done for this style. Well, I guess there was Mega Man and Bass, but I wouldn't call that a mainline game. I do recommend anyone who hasn't played this entry to give it a shot, but even more so to the people who have never played any Mega Man game ever. Oh yeah, April Fools. This isn't a fighting game video or whatever.